Hi, everybody. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Welcome and thank you for joining us today.
I think we'll give it a few minutes for people to join. Yeah. Welcome everybody, and as you join, please introduce yourself in the chat. To say who you are, where you're coming from. Two more minutes.
Well, I think we can get started, Elizabeth. I think people will be joining us as as we begin.
Okay, thank you, Brett. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our distinguished panelists and participants, especially those who have woken up so early this morning or who are staying up very late to be with us for this webinar. My name is Elizabeth Lule. I'm the Executive Director of the Early Childhood Development Action Network, otherwise known as Ekdan. We're a global ECD network of networks, providing a global platform that catalyzes collective and collaborative action between our partners. So a warm welcome to our panelists and to the participants to this webinar on elevating childcare as a political issue during an election year and beyond. But before we begin, I'd like to share a little context on why Ekdan is prioritizing childcare at this time. When COVID-19 hit and we realized it would have a lasting impact on children because of the prolonged lockdowns, disrupted services, and with all access to childcare completely cut off for parents and caregivers of children. Parents were juggling work and looking after their children at the same time and figuring out how they could continue their learning and or their well-being being taken care of. So we quickly consulted our partners and asked a very simple question. What is the most critical challenge that is facing young children, and how should Ekdan respond? And time again, childcare showed up as a priority. Everybody was experiencing that. And as we all know, childcare is an issue that is deeply rooted in the huge inequalities that exist in all our societies. It exacerbated gender inequalities in the home. Young girls actually dropped out of school to look after siblings. So it generated, and then there were the learning losses, especially for young children as part of their development. The need is great, but the barriers to access quality and affordable childcare services are even greater, especially for the most vulnerable and for the poor. So our partners all agreed that we should launch a global childcare campaign that focuses on advocacy to build the political commitment that we need, but also learn from each other. And I think this webinar is a great example of how we will be learning from how different countries in different contexts have addressed it. And then we also built strategic partnerships, and we have 24 partners that form the global partnership, the global advocacy and policy advisory group for Ekdan, who are co-creating the global childcare campaign. But that said, to be successful in this vision, we have to lift up and support the ongoing efforts at the country level to strengthen the policy and legal frameworks, but most importantly, to increase public spending so that we can have the meaningful change that young children and their parents require. And this is typically also works through local champions as well, who demand the action from their governments. Now, while we are seeing a lot of global momentum around childcare and everybody is publishing papers about the benefits of childcare and the fact that it's good for children, it's good for women, it's good for the workforce, especially for women to rejoin the workforce, and obviously it's good for economies. We're not seeing the growing political commitment at the country level. And we know countries face obviously very tight fiscal spaces, but this is critical to build their human capital, but also to make sure that economies grow and women can participate in the workforce even more. But we're also looking at childcare itself in terms of generating jobs for childcare workers, and most importantly, that we can pay them much better than we did before COVID. So today we have a distinguished panel of speakers from across the globe, from many different countries, and we will learn on how they have or are trying to make childcare and elevate childcare as a political priority during an election year and beyond. And with that, I would like to introduce my colleague, Brett Weissel, who is our policy and advocacy lead for Ekdan, who will be today's moderator. Over to you, Brett.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm Brett Weissel, the Global Policy and Advocacy Lead with Ekdan. And many thanks for joining us. Please also continue to share your name and organization through the chat. So I want to get to the webinar right away, but just a few remarks. As Elizabeth mentioned, this webinar is one of several that we want to do around childcare. And early education is part of this global childcare campaign. And specifically for today, we're going to look at advocacy strategies to elevate childcare as a political issue, to engage and educate candidates and policymakers, to hold them accountable for their promises after an election, et cetera. And so, I recognize that this webinar is a little bit different than maybe some of the others that we've done at Ekdan if you've joined us in the past. And that's, many of the webinars that we do are very technical focused, and this is a little bit of a different type of webinar, and so we're really thankful for you for joining us. But it's simply recognizing that, that policy change is an essential lever to improve outcomes for children, and we need to highlight the work that advocates are doing in this space so that we can learn from them. Advocacy is going to be a critical strategy now and in the future. And we want to make sure we're creating that space for advocates to come together to share and learn. And so, this topic actually came about from a series of listening sessions that we did with partners. And it's an issue that kept popping up in different contexts and different conversations. Some partners were already really doing great work in this space. And so we wanted to highlight that. Others were interested in getting engaged or had election years themselves coming up. And we're trying to figure out how to position their work, how to position childcare as an issue that candidates should be talking about and should be developing platforms around. So we brought together this diverse panel of experts for you today who have a lot of experience in this space. And while our focus is on election years, these strategies are applicable in any given year and are going to be relevant for advocates in different political contexts and different political systems. One thing that I've learned in my time working in advocacy is that advocacy is advocacy. It's the levers that you have at your disposal are pretty much the same. What you need to be able to do is adapt to your context. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that today. So let me quickly introduce our distinguished panelists here today. We do have a slight programming change. One of our panelists, Jay Wetherill, is ill, and so thankfully, we have a terrific replacement in Juan Laranaga. He is the Policy and Portfolio Manager at the Minderoo Foundation's Thrive by 5 Coalition. He overseeing Minderoo's investments in the early years and relationships with sector and research partners, including the Western Australia government, key early childhood stakeholders in Australia and across Latin America. And Juan has extensive experience in this space. We're really looking forward to hearing more about the work that they've done in Australia and beyond. And a special thanks to Juan for joining us at such a late hour. It is indeed late in Australia. Our next panelist is Miriam Prada. She is the Executive Director of ANDI, Communications and Rights in Brazil. For the last 4 years, she was the coordinator of the executive secretary at RNPI, which is the National Network of Early Childhood. And now she's part of the executive team of an initiative called Agenda 227, where she's engaged in the 22 presidential election campaign. And she's going to talk a little bit more about Agenda 227 and what they've done. And joining Miriam is Renato Godoy, advocacy coordinator with the Alana Institute, where he has helped to lead the development and implementation of Agenda 227. Next up is Albert Watt. He is the Senior Policy Director at the Alliance for Early Success in the United States, where he supports the organization's strategy and goals for early education, including access to high-quality pre-K and childcare, improving the early learning workforce, and enhancing alignment with K-12 policies. And finally, and also my sincere thanks to him for waking up quite early. He is in the West Coast US time, so many thanks to him. And finally, we have Angela Taneja, who is the lead specialist in equality and essential services at Oxfam India. Her expertise lies in social accountability and has engaged with various social networks and movements on education and other essential services. She's one of the founding members of the RTE Forum, India's largest education network, and coordinates the Fight Inequality Alliance in India. And I think she's joining us at a relatively inconvenient time for her, but I guess only somewhat so. So you can truly see we are a global network indeed. So we have a really impressive panel. I want to get right to them. Just a quick note on how today's webinar will work. Each panelist is going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about the strategies and experiences from their work. Then we're going to have a brief Q&A amongst us, and then open it up to the audience for Q&A. So if you have questions, please share them via chat. We'll pull those questions from the chat and ask our panelists. But for now, I'm going to pass it off to Juan, who's going to talk a little bit about his work in Australia.
Thank you, Brett. I might share my screen just to get going. And please let me know once it's up.
You are good, Juan.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you, Brett, and thank you, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to be able to present to a very exclusive panel. And again, apologies for Jay not being here. We've freshly coming from an election campaign. So I'm about to share you our story in terms of what we've undertaken in Australia. I'll start off with playing a video. This is just post election win we had a change of government, and this is the incoming government. So I'm just going to play the video, hoping it works. So that was really only a matter of a few weeks ago, and in reality, considering all the issues that were happening, in Australia, particularly around cost of living, COVID, and a whole range of other political issues including cost of living, childcare should not have been a major election issue. But as a result of the work we've been doing in the last 2 years leading up to the election and campaigning, we've managed to get it central to the election process that we've just undertaken. So like Brett said, we're from Thrive by 5. We're an initiative of the Minderoo Foundation, which we're an Australasian philanthropy. And we're essentially been campaigning as part of Thrive by 5 on early learning and childcare, and particularly focusing around the development of high quality, universal accessible system, which is essentially what Elizabeth was explaining in terms of the benefits it could provide a nation. The big focus is around systems change, and I won't delve too much into systems change because I'm assuming that this is an important topic, we're all focused and understanding in terms of what this actually means. But more essentially, rather than just the resources and policies and services, it's also about how systems are maintained, and that encompasses language, culture, and interests and practice, and essentially the power that brings. So it's about understanding and managing those components as part of that system change process, which sometimes is not often considered. We talk about the policies and resource flow, funding flows, and the various government instruments and levers, but we necessarily don't always think about those other elements that that exist within that system. Our focus in terms of that campaign has really been around strategic communications. So this notion around activist philanthropy. And we know that if we're going to create systems change, we need to influence the political process. And government as the main duty bearer is who we need to influence in that system. So this requires creating a political movement to create that change. And a lot of times we talk about framing, and particularly around the neuroscience, and we know that the brain story is important, but what we've learned is it's not sufficient to create that pressure on government, to create that political change. So the idea that was sat behind the campaign was that we needed to create a problem for government, and that problem meant that if government didn't listen, there was a price to be paid. And as we saw in Australia, it resulted in a change of government. So why a campaign? And as I mentioned, this is around problematizing early childhood development. So making that framing be understood in a way that governments felt that they needed to be influencing the public. And as Elizabeth said, childcare was kind of the cross-cutting theme that covered not only the neuroscience and why it's the benefits on children in terms of those early years, but also it became a gender issue and the importance for supporting women. And in Australia, we have the highest level of one of the highest levels of professionally qualified females, yet we're ranked 70th in terms of female participation in the workforce. So again, a very disproportionate of female engagement within the workforce, and essentially a lot of this relates to the cost of living and the affordability of childcare. So in order to be successful in a campaign, we needed to create a goal, and the goal was focused around coalition forming. So how do we bring all the various sectors that involve and encompass the early childhood system and try to unify them under a common goal? And this notion around high quality, universal, accessible, affordable early system was the goal that we worked towards, and we managed to bring that coalition. And we used influential, not only political figures, but influential thought leaders in this space to champion this cause, but also help build and strengthen the network and reach out and build that coalition. And we ran a whole range of different forums and events to try and start to mobilize the concept and also mobilize the various constituents, including the grassroots movement, which meant the public and parents. So part of the campaign was really about understanding what does that architecture look like, and we looked at three key elements: the outside track, which is really about the public-facing part of the campaign, and again, childcare became the terminology that was used, and I'll go a little bit more into why we used that and how we managed to kind of maintain a coalition around that concept. The inside track, and the inside track really was around the confidential, behind the scenes problem definition and solution brokering. And so that meant forming a roundtable of a range of bureaucrats, think tanks, researchers, sector leaders, thought leaders to actually understand and create what that system could look like, and then start to build out some recommendations around if we were to be successful, how do we implement and start to create that system, the ideal system that we want. And the third component, which is really the critical part of this, was around stakeholder management. So again, trying to build a wide, broad coalition, a broad-fronted coalition, and maintaining that coalition requires a level of strategic thinking and operation. And so that was also a very important part to kind of keep those diverse views and diverse opinions and priorities aligned to that one common message. And across those three pillars of the campaign architecture, the key parts were around strategic partnerships. So the outside track, you know, our strategic partner was a very specialized communications company who were known for this type of politicizing and, you know, smart use of both mainstream and social media, and creating the narratives that would actually influence and draw attention to the topic. Centre for Policy Development were kind of the leading think tank in this space, and they were responsible for bringing together the inside, you know, confidential coalition that would actually help define the problem, and then use that problem definition to start to structure the system design. And then ARACI were as an alliance of research partners and a world-respected research peak. And the idea was they had the reputation, the connections, and their role was really around identifying and supporting the engagement of key stakeholders, but also about building and collecting intelligence around what was being said, and trying to manage and develop tactics around mitigating some of those potentially dissenting voices and helping them bring them back into the engagement with the campaign. So the outside track was really around those narratives. So again, the importance of the brain, what happens in the brain development in those early years, the cost of living and affordability, the gender equity story, and again around female participation, and the economic story, you know, the cost of living. As Elizabeth said, you know, these are, you know, four key issues, and childcare essentially was the kind of the unifying topic that actually was able to address all those elements, you know, with one single framing. And again, and that wasn't easy because the early childhood health specialists, you know, early childhood educators, professional networks, all had their opinions around the use of the word childcare. But we're able to manage that through understanding that one thing was around the tactics to create that political movement and that pressure, versus trying to appease everyone's opinions around how we should frame that topic. So again, that was part of you know, building that narrative, engaging the right stakeholders and networks, and then manage that through building the understanding around why this was an important tactic, and why childcare was really the arrowhead that was going to create that pressure on government. And then it was around the importance of using evidence, and then using evidence not in the common sense around, you know, academic publications, but really understanding and identifying key political weak spots in the early childhood system that actually would generate interest, mobilize the constituents, both the sector and the public. And so we were able to, as part of this, commission certain reports and certain publications that would actually capture key elements of what was wrong with the system. One of those was a report we recently released called the Childcare Desert, which maps, geospatially mapped kind of the proportion of childcare availability versus the number of children that were vying for that one spot. And what it identified was that the more rural, remote, or the more disadvantaged neighbourhoods had less childcare availability, which meant that there was more children competing for the limited spots, and those areas that were more affluent had a lot more availability of childcare. So again, the privileged areas had more access, the less privileged had less. And what that generated was that it didn't matter where you're from, what religious beliefs or ethnic orientation, you were able to actually look up your neighbourhood and actually identify where your neighbourhood, your community stood in terms of accessibility to good quality early childhood. So that created a whole range of media, and we were able to use that media and that interest to build that momentum and really kind of build that pressure on government. And interestingly, that document, which I can share after the, continues to be referenced and cross-referenced both from government, the sector, and various media outlets around the problem with our current system. And then we also released a whole range of other reports that looked at, the cost of not intervening and preventing early and what that impacts on future budgets, as well as undertaking social research and polling to build and understand community attitudes and salience of what that issue and what it meant to that. And we're able to use that data back to reflect back on what was what is the issue that we're dealing with and why it was so important. So the Inside Track commissioned a report as a result of that forming of that discrete coalition, and that was really the work of identifying the problem, creating a solution, costing that solution out, and actually then looking at what the sequencing would be like if the government was to implement those key recommendations. So that report was released just before the election, and again became a really critical document that was quoted and referenced in order to help identify what the ideal system could look like for Australia, and again create additional media and publicity around, again, the issue on the public arena. As I mentioned, the stakeholder management, really critical piece, and the five kind of key components of what makes up the early childhood system, the various different views and framing of how they saw the system meant that we needed to be really tactful and intelligent around how we managed their key interests, and in the interest of forming the coalition and maintaining that coalition of key strategic partners around using what was going to create the greatest political pressure and what was understood by the mainstream public, both parents, the sector and government. And again, we had that strategic partner who was really responsible for building that network, growing that network of stakeholders, and then again identifying where there was dissent, how do we kind of manage that and bring them back under the tent in the best interest of achieving the agenda of winning the campaign. So it's really this notion around many voices, one message, and again building on what already exists. So the campaign was not something that was commenced from Minderoo, initiated, but actually what we were able to do is actually there was a whole range of different networks that were campaigning on the issue from different perspectives. And what we were able to do is actually bring all those existing campaigns and unifying them under one key campaign, which then that power of kind of the collective was actually what was the unique difference. And Minderoo was able to bring that together because, again, of the resources that we brought to the campaign. And as a result, since the election, the government committed to about 28 billion over the next 10 years, which was the single biggest election commitment that they made throughout the campaign. And again, childcare really should be there in interest of what was going on, not only in Australia but globally. They've agreed to reform the current system, and as you saw in the initial video, they see that as their legacy. And then in the last couple of weeks, subnational governments have made various commitments, which total to about 16.5 billion over the next 10 years. So significant commitments to this space, and actually, premiers of each of the leaders of each of the states leading their conferences around with the importance of the brain story and neurodevelopment in the early years. So again, the question is really around, is this a role for philanthropy? Should we play in this space? And if so, what is it that we can do and why philanthropy as opposed to other, local networks and campaign movements? And that's my story. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you, Juan. Those are incredible outcomes, and just goes to show the power of concerted, effective strategic advocacy can yield tremendous results. And I also think I speak for all of us on today's webinar when I say we welcome philanthropy's investments in advocacy and policy change, and are thankful for that. Okay, next up is Miriam. Miriam and Renato, let me pull up your slides.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so hello to everybody. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Brett, and all my colleagues here. Thank you for everybody that are listening to us. Could you go to the first one, please, Brett, before this one? So, because it is, yes, we are a movement from the civil society organization in Brazil that's called Agenda 227. Agenda 227 is an article of our federal constitution that guarantees absolute priority for children and adolescents in Brazil. So what we want is that in this 2022 Brazil's presidential election, this is guaranteed. So now, yes, please, the next one, Brett. So what we are saying with this movement is that the childhood and adolescence should be at the center of the discussion. And this movement from the civil society organization is building a just, inclusive, and democratic society, and it's contingent on assigning maximum priority to the rights of children and adolescents in the policy-making and implementation process. We are bound by the recognition that the upcoming presidential election will stand as a decisive moment for Brazil's future. Okay, the next, please. So, as I can understand that everybody knows or hears about, Brazil is facing one of the most challenging periods in its recent history, pointing to a confluence of multiple crises that will significantly complicate the task of the candidate who assumes the presidency in January 2023. So at this moment, we have more than 640,000 fatalities from COVID. We return to the hunger map with more than 55% of our population facing food insecurity. We have 12.4 million unemployed persons in Brazil at this moment. We increase of almost 200% the number of children between 5 and 9 years of age who are not in school. Black youth account for 80% of violent death when they have between 10 and 19 years old in this segment. And in 2021, the deforestation of the legal Amazon reached its highest rate in 15 years. So what we are, this scenario in Brazil, it's very critical. So this alliance that the civil society are making and working for is to put the children and adolescents in the center of this debate so we can guarantee this democratic change in Brazil. The next, please. We developed a set of 148 public policies proposals rooted in socioeconomic indicators and context analysis, presented to the political parties, their candidates, and the general public. So at the outset, we affirm the centrality of child and adolescents' rights as an absolute priority for the construction of a just and democratic society in an ecologically balanced environment. Identifying children and adolescents, irrespective of social class, place of residence, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or disability, among other contribution factors to increase vulnerability, as a strategic priority of the programs and policies implemented as of 2023 means, above all, fulfilling Article 227 of the 1988 Brazilian Federal Constitution and the commitments that Brazil undertook by the time of ratification of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child in September 1991. So the next, please. Similarly, adopt a humanized management approach grounded in the commitment to attend to and care for the needs of the general population and founded on the state's duty to guarantee the full body of rights in Brazilian law. A country that respects children and adolescents is necessarily a country in which the principle of human dignity is ensured to all women and men. After all, the integral protection and development of children and adolescents cannot be achieved without providing care to caregivers. Okay, so here I brought some data. What is the situation of the access to childcare in Brazil? So we have our last data is that it is slowly growing, the access of children from 0 to 3 years old to the childcare, but it is still only 39% of the Brazilian children that have access to childcare. And among the Black children, only 32% have access to childcare. So once Ekdan has this focus now at this moment at election, we would like to share this data with you and to assure that in our proposals, we have some of them that is connected with the child care. And now I will give the word to my colleague, Renato Godoy, and thank you to everybody.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you, Miriam, for the presentation. Thank you, Brett, and thank you, Elizabeth and Ekdan for the invitation. So I will talk a little bit about the Brazilian context, adding some information, but to develop the 148 proposal that Miriam mentioned, we promoted with several organizations and specialists an accurate analysis of the Brazilian context in the last 7 years. And we found a very challenging scenario, as Miriam said, with the increasement of the poverty, the increasement of the hunger, and the effects of extreme climate events caused by human-induced global warming that affects the most vulnerable population, especially children and adolescents. So additionally, Brazil is still suffering the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on children and adolescents. The pandemic in Brazil produced very bad, very serious outcomes in terms of social indicators, resulting in adverse impacts on their physical and mental well-being, the increasing educational poverty, rising of the violence, domestic violence, and created great obstacles on support and protection networks. And there is an upsurge in orphanhood caused by COVID-19, with more than 100,000 children that lost parents for the COVID-19, and the increasement of the digital inequality due to low connectivity and lack of communication access. And as I said before, and as Miriam said as well, worsening increasement of levels of extreme poverty and food insecurity. So to reach the next slide, please. Let me see. Yes. With the to reach the goal of the Agenda 227 movement, it's so to implement the absolute priority of children's right in Brazil, we constructed these 148 public policies proposal that Miriam mentioned, and also at the same time we developed an advocacy strategy to dialogue with the presidential candidates for the next election in October. So we started a dialogue with 10 candidates presenting our movement, our goals, looking to establish a compromise with the political leadership to include our proposal or our 148 proposal in their political platform for the presidential election next October. So we are inviting the whole society and mainly the political leadership to debate the most challenging issues of the country based on the Article 227 of our Constitution that defend the children's rights as absolute priority of our country. So we have founded a good response of the candidates and the parties about the idea of the absolute priority. But because we know that this sounds very good, especially in a electoral year, but we have emphasized that our main goal isn't only to include the absolute priority in the speech of the candidates or in the platform of the candidates, but to include the absolute priority specifically in the reality of the public policies in Brazil. So we need to put the children's rights in our public budget, because we know that in Brazil, for example, even with the rule of the absolute priority written in our constitution, nowadays the social investment in areas related to children is only around 3% of our public budget. It's a research made by UNICEF in Brazil. And we are discussing with the candidates that given the complexity of the current national scenario, we need the adoption of emergency measures to mitigate this scenario. And so it should be included as an indispensable component of the platforms of the candidates, these emergency measures. But at the same time, it's our hope, and we are working for this, that the candidate elected in October will put in place a medium and long range project capable of advancing definitive solutions to the structural factors that condemn a significant part of our population to live without fundamental rights. So we are promoting an advocacy strategy for that. So besides this direct contact with the candidates, we are at the same time promoting public hearings, presenting Agenda 227, presenting our 148 proposal in the Chamber of the Deputies and the Senate to promote Agenda 227 among the political leadership, among the deputies and senators, and spreading the idea of the absolute priority in our representative houses. So next slide, please. At the same time, we are promoting at the same time we are promoting an advocacy strategy. We are promoting a media strategy as well. So with a lot of goals and complementary goals that complements our advocacy strategy, like sensitize opinion makers on the importance of the children's and adolescents rights agenda for the country's development, not only for the children but for the whole country. I think it's the main message that Agenda 227 spreads. To contribute to placing the agenda of children's and adolescents' rights in the public and electoral debates, and draw attention to raise awareness to the impact of environmental devastation on this agenda and their impact in children development, and connect this agenda to the major national themes. So it's the main objective, the main goal is to connect the agenda of the children's rights with the national themes that will be debated by the candidates in this election. Like, for instance, fight against hunger and poverty, based on the Article 227 of our Constitution, education, health, economy, fight against racism, inclusion, and public safety. So we are promoting a strategy and a movement to present the movement to the main newsroom in Brazil in a PR strategy, and give adequate emphasis to the importance of the children's and adolescents' right agenda at this moment in the country. So, and at last but not least, to seize opportunities to carry the movement's key message. So next slide, please. So we are on social networks, spreading our message in YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and our website, agenda227.org.br, with the where is this document with the 148 proposal constructed by our broad coalition with more than 150 organizations that promoted this document and that promote this Agenda 227. That's a movement that we want to continue even after the Brazilian election next October. So next slide. So thank you so much for the invitation again, and we are available to answer questions and to debate with our colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miriam and Renato. I'm just immensely impressed around the Agenda 227, and what you've done is sort of create this formalized multi-sectoral platform to funnel in different policy positions and perspectives and align those, and then funnel those towards candidates. It's just incredible work, and I think it's a really interesting model that I would love to learn more about and to continue to highlight in different audiences. So with that, we're going to move along to Albert.
Great. Thank you, Brett and Elizabeth, for having me here. And it's been really inspiring to hear from other countries. I don't usually get the opportunity to engage with other nations' efforts in early childhood education. And yeah, it's been really educational and inspiring. So I work in an organization in the United States called the Alliance for Early Success. Just a few words about what we do and how we work. We are basically a network of state and national advocacy and policy organizations in all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. They are working together to advance early childhood policies and investments really at the state level. We don't directly work at the national federal level. We focus a lot of our work at the state level because in the United States, we have such a decentralized kind of government that the states have a lot of discretion at how they fund and support early care education. And it's also important to know that our work in states goes beyond early child education. We also invest in issues around family support, economic support, health, provisions of health, et cetera. And we are an intermediate organization. So there's been a lot of talk today about the role of philanthropy. So we actually serve as an intermediate organization for 15 investors, 15 philanthropies who provide funding for us. And then we re-grant the money out into this network of state and national organizations to support their work, their advocacy work. We also do a lot of facilitation of peer-to-peer learning across the country and connecting states to national resources and expertise, et cetera. So during the election seasons, our goal, so we don't sort of engage in election work on our own. We work through and with our partners in states. And our goal is really to try to elevate early care education, early childhood issues in general during the campaign, during the debates among candidates. Obviously we would love for the winning candidate at the end to have a platform, a very specific platform to advance early childhood education and early childhood issues. But we also think it's really important to make that issue a priority in the debate so that it gets debated, it gets attention, and the candidates compete over themselves about how they're going to support these issues. That in and of itself is a win for us. So what I'm about to share with you is sort of my observations over the course of the time that I've been working in this space about what our advocacy partners do during election seasons, and some of the resources that we provide to support them in this work. So the first thing I would say, if Brad, if you can move to the next slide, is that we try to frame early child education as a bipartisan issue. And, so bipartisan meaning in the United States context, supported by Democrats and Republicans, sort of the more liberal and the more conservative parties in our country. So this is a poll that is done by the Children's Funding Project, one of our national partners. And just the basic takeaway here is that in the United States, we have pretty strong support for early childhood issues. And so you'll see 82% of the voters polled here believe that it's extremely important, very important to give children a strong start in life. And that compares really well to things that are really important to politicians, right? Strengthening the economy, reducing taxes and government spending. Those are sort of, for in the United States, important issues for our politicians. So we try to frame it as this, to tell people, politicians and candidates, that this is, has broad political support. On the next slide, you'll see another poll done by another one of our partners, First 5 Years Fund, that shows that this support is bipartisan. Again, both Democrats, Republicans, and people in between, independents. Here you see the percentage of voters who believe early child education is a good investment of taxpayer money, gets, again, broad support across political parties, and particularly 2/3 of Republicans, the more conservative party, support this notion. Voters in that party support the notion. So on the next slide, you'll continue to see this bipartisan support. And this one goes to the point of that increasing funding. So we're getting more specific, that should we be increasing federal funding, national funding for childcare and preschool? Again, you see pretty strong bipartisan support. It does dip down as you get to the more conservative voters. For Republicans, that stands at about 43%. But that is still pretty strong across the board. And so we try to, during the election season, a lot of our advocates, both at the national and state level, really try to point this out. And the final poll takeaway I will share is, this is again, going back to the Children's Funding Project poll, is that what we learn from polling is that our American voters actually support increasing taxes, which is sometimes, we assume that in America that raising taxes is just a non-starter and nobody wants to raise taxes. But when you poll people about raising taxes and you give them information about how much we're talking about and what it's going to, what this poll shows is that, again, both Republicans and Democrats support raising taxes, depending on the level. And this one, it says, if we raise, the highest support is for when you raise $25 annually per, for that household, for early child education, again, pretty strong support across parties. So, that's all great. So this is the base that we're working from. And then a lot of people today have talked about messaging and sort of how to communicate this in a way that resonates with voters and politicians. So in the next slide, I want to share, you can go beyond that slide. Okay. Just a little bit of that. There you go, stay there. On this slide, these are the kind of, over the course of time, the kind of framing that advocates have used to sort of convey the importance of early child education to candidates, so that basically, the idea is whatever the candidate cares about, we want to make sure that early childhood is one strategy to address that priority for that candidate, for that elected official. So again, people have talked about already the importance of elevating the importance of child development, brain development, using the science and research that we know so well around brain development, the critical period that this is for kids, and how there's so much so many kids have an unequal start in life because of the lack of support during the early years. So really, that is obviously an important kind of message and frame. Another thing that advocates have used in the past is thinking about how to connect early childhood to education reform, which is sort of in a more public education space. Again, leaning on some of the research about school readiness and the opportunity to prepare kids for success in school and when they enter school and beyond. A lot of elected officials in the United States really care a lot about public education, and they know that issue much better than early childhood. So we try to connect that to that frame. A third one that people, again, on this in this panel have talked about is about how the connection between early childhood and workforce support. A lot of times we try to frame childcare preschool as a two-generation strategy, so that you support the kids, but you also support the parents in terms of helping the parents, have a stable family life, have a stable work life. A phrase that a lot of advocates like to use is that early childhood education supports the workforce of today and also the workforce for tomorrow. And so that's the tagline that a lot of advocates like to use. A couple of other frames that have come that advocates have used is the connection, the relationship between early childhood education and health and fitness of children. There's also some research about that, and that helps us talk about early prevention and how that cut costs in the future around healthcare. And some people might be interested and maybe surprised to also hear some of the advocates in the United States tying the issue of health and fitness in the early years to military preparedness. There's actually some, advocacy organizations that look at, sort of highlight the point that in the United States, a lot of people don't qualify for the military because we're not fit, we're not healthy, the overall population, and that early childhood could be one strategy to build a more healthy population that will help military preparedness. So that's an interesting kind of connection. And then public safety is another one that might be a little bit, unique in our context. So drawing from some of the longitudinal research about early childhood education and how it supports persistence in school, graduation from high school, going into college, and supporting economic stability in people's lives in the long term as adults and going to the workforce. All sort of all those outcomes help prevents crime and other engagement in the juvenile justice systems, for example, and that relationship comes sometimes advocates play up to candidates who care about those issues. And all of this, right, is sort of adds up from an economic point of view to a return on investment. So that is another frame that we advocates also promote a lot, is that every dollar you spend on early childhood provides a return of $7, $13, whatever. There are a number of research that shows that kind of return on investment because of the outcomes that you see in this slide in front of you. So we've made a lot of progress, and unfortunately, I'm not going to talk too much about the progress that we've made because I want to talk about some of the lessons learned and what we're thinking, what we're how we're thinking about kind of doing things a little differently in the future. So before I get to the lessons learned, I want to just kind of point out that the United States, we've made a lot of progress, but we're very far from where we need to be, right? So for example, public funding for childcare right now in the United States is only for low-income families who work. And even for those families who qualify for childcare subsidies from the government, only 1 in 6 eligible families have access to a subsidy, can access to a subsidy. We're not fully funding the program. The federal preschool program, which we call Head Start, serves only children in poverty. And even with that population, we serve about half of them. In the states, states do support state preschool, fund state preschool on their own. Most of the states do, not all of them, but most of them do. But even then, only 5% of 3-year-olds and 29% of 4-year-olds are enrolled in any kind of state-funded preschool program. The median wage for early child educators in the United States is about $12 an hour. That equates to about maybe $25,000 a year of annual income. And in the United States, that's just above poverty level for a family of 3. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I can go on and on, I'm not going to do that. So what are we learning from this, right? So where's the resistance coming from in the United States to invest more? So I want to sort of talk a little bit about that. There is a debate in our country and with elected officials about the role of families, and I would say particularly mothers, vis-a-vis the government. And there is this, in early care education, there's this still a belief that that is really the realm of family, a realm of personal family responsibility, as opposed to a more systemic solution, a more government solution. So there's that kind of debate going on. And then related to that, there is some in the more conservative side of sort of thought leaders, more support for strengthening the family unit. So for example, providing direct payments to families as opposed to having the government fund childcare and preschool and subsidize those services. So there's that kind of dichotomy going on. And finally, I think there is still undervaluing early child education and a perception that people who are working in early child education, the teachers who work in those programs, they don't have to be very professional. They don't have to have a high level of training or professional support. And so I think that also contributes to the investment in early child education. So what are some promising strategies that we think we're kind of leaning into based on some work that we've done with communications research folks and consultants, particularly consultants who work with more conservative leaning voters and elected officials. One is that we need to really try to humanize the cause that we're fighting for. I think a lot of us like to talk about systems and policy and budgets and data and research and the market. And at the end of the day, this is about kids and families. And maybe oftentimes we don't lead with that as much as we need to. One of the communications consultants that we work with like to say that, children are the great unifier. Everybody wants the best for their own children and generally for children, in all families. So we need to really kind of think about how do we lead more with that, with making sure that kids and families show up in our message, be really visible in our message. So related to that, putting families at the center, what does that mean? So really trying to acknowledge their pain, especially during the pandemic. There is a lot of struggling families out there, both in low-income families and also middle-income families in the United States. And how can early childhood education and early childhood investment in general change the status quo for those families, address the struggles and pain? We also need to emphasize that early childhood investments can speak to what families value. And there are three things that we're thinking, we think we should need to focus on. One is that it provides families with choice. Again, in the United States, it's really important for the individual families, the parents, to have choice and to feel like they have control over the kids, sort of future and what they are doing with the kids. And we want to think about government as a partner to families rather than as the solution, the only solution, or as definitely not as a replacement to what families should be doing and can do for their kids. Another is financial security, really leaning into, again, the early childhood investment, helping families create a more stable economic life for themselves. And again, some of my fellow panelists have talked about that. And finally, happiness. A lot of times we want to talk about, and it's really important to talk about school readiness and achievement gap and all that, and not all that's very important. But at the end of the day, again, based on some of our work with communication, we want to elevate that families want their kids to be happy, and how can early child investments support that general well-being of kids at that part of their lives. I'm sorry, nope, you're jumping around. So I'm gonna go back to that slide, that one. Yep. Lessons learned. So we want to, another lesson we're looking at is how, making sure that we appeal to the common good and prosperity. This is a collective good for our communities, for all families, for all communities. There is a lot of disparities, there is a lot of inequities in our system, as people have mentioned in other countries, but we want to lead with that. This is early care education is important for our common good, common prosperity, and then highlight where there are disparities, whether it's by income, by race, etc. And all this is getting us to think about how we can lean more into elevating the voices of grassroots leaders, particularly parents and early childhood educators. Traditionally, our messengers have been what we called grass tops leaders. So they're advocates, they're business leaders, economists, researchers, public education leaders, and others who have more direct relationship with candidates and elected officials. We're thinking that we need to build more of a powerful voice that coming up from the grassroots, whether it's parents or early child educators, so that they can speak from their own experience, talk to some of those issues that I talk, in terms of, really putting kids and families at the center. I'm really maybe leading more into the values of this as opposed to the evidence and research. All those things are still going to be important. We're not kind of let go of the research and evidence, but we're thinking that we need to sort of, elevate the values and the principles of what we're talking about as much as the data and the policy and the research. So I'll stop there because I think we're running long. So and pass it on to the next person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Albert. This was really informative, and I think this issue, this cultural issue around the role of families versus the role of government, is one that plays out in many countries and in different ways, and just goes to show the need to really align your messaging with your key targets. With that, I'd like to pass it off to Angela, who's going to walk us through her work in India. Angela, the floor is yours.
I may be paid by Oxfam India, but fundamentally it was a campaign which was run by 3 alliances. From an early childhood education / development lens, it's the Alliance for the Right to ECD, whose which has been leading the work on early childhood. And the Right to Education Forum is the umbrella network that works on the range of issues related to education from the young child upwards to secondary education. We also had the campaign against child labor that was part of the mobilization. Next slide. So therefore, it was a collective effort. For us as Oxfam India, we also had, just for the record, we had a 5 states parallel health track. For Oxfam India, it was the Yes Democracy campaign from a point of view of with us acting in some ways a fiscal sponsor for some of the pieces, but also being part of a lot of these pieces. Some of the overarching planning was fundamentally done with the 3 networks together. So therefore, from an Oxfam lens, it's a 5 states where we worked intensively, but fundamentally the campaign was in roughly 20 states, which basically means the majority of the country, of this country with 1.3 billion people. Next slide. And that in 3 stages, which in some ways is logical in that sense. We, in terms of influencing the manifestos, which was also in some ways a bit of getting our act together in terms of actually going for the advocacy and campaigning. The actual engagements with candidates at the time of the election, and also subsequently outreach to the new government and commitment tracking, with the intention of at least tracking the first 100 days of the new government, so that the whole point of doing all this is to translate it into commitments from a government, and not just get signatures and get more broad at the initial stages. Next slide. So influencing manifesto preparation, we prepared our own civil society manifesto and report card on education with the 3 national alliances. Therefore, the Alliance to Right to ECD led on the ECD related asks and the performance of the government. At the same time, we had inputs from, since India is a federal country, also from inputs from members at state level. So the three networks plus their constituent members at state level go together with the same set of asks based on a consistent set of evidence. There were at the same time other parallel processes of civil society engagement around the election. So therefore, the three networks effectively became the education and young child input into the overarching process. We also had fairly intensive 2-day residential face-to-face planning meeting on how would this actually work, followed by an outreach to manifesto committees. We've had a halfway decent track record of having met all the, at least the opposition manifesto committees with our asks and the report card, and several of them took up at least some of our issues into their own party manifestos. When manifestos came out, we also collectively did an analysis of the manifestos against our original CSO asks, so that we have a sense of which party is getting what traction, and also from a point of view of engagement. And we of course use this time on constituency building and the preparation for the campaign rollout. The colorful thing to the right is the kind of stakeholders that one engaged with, which is lawyers, retired government officials, for the health strand, patient right groups, the education stakeholders, equivalent would be the parent groups, school management committee members, which are the parents who in the government school and early childhood system who have interest in the education of their children, teachers, including teacher unions, local representatives, youth, the candidates themselves, obviously, and the media. Next. Then the actual dates got announced, and one could then start interfacing with candidates. Therefore, we ran a fairly decentralized campaign, which basically means giving people the asks, giving people a centralized pool of materials across three networks. Wherever there are members of the network, they can run with the same messaging. Given it is a country of 1.4 billion people, given the fact that each province, even provinces, for example, one of the very active states was the state of Uttar Pradesh, the population is equal to Brazil by itself. So therefore, what we can't control, we didn't try. What we did try to do is ensure that there are meetings of civil society organizations with the government and people, so in support of the asks, so that when it comes to implementation, subsequent implementation, it doesn't come out of the blue. Why are you asking for this? But also, obviously, with the candidate themselves, as well as the party representatives, to make sure that with a request to sign a pledge card of and to endorse the asks. And for them to do that, one will need to have some environment building activities. So therefore, youth especially came forward, but also a larger mobilization, song, drama, street plays, poetry, etc. So that the messaging of the fact that you need to address the needs of children at this point in time and vote for, not just for the party, not just for whatever issues, it's critical that you vote for who you like, but fundamentally whoever you vote for needs to also ensure that education becomes a priority. We therefore had interface with officials, candidates, etc. On ground in the 5 states that I know, we could have a monitoring and evaluation system. We had at least 354 events. Our guesstimate is at least 500,000 people were reached. Hey, it's India. We have anything happens on scale, if it happens at all. In terms of it was also amplified online. So our estimate is 55 million impressions, around 581K in engagements, 547K link clicks. Therefore, again, one has the advantage of it being India. We have people is what we have. Next slide. Some visuals, people supporting the mobilization, people signing a petition, as well as the outreach to candidates to the left. The one on top is now our India's defense minister, who signed the pledge card. Therefore, we tried to make sure that it was across party lines to the extent to which we could. Next. So we had the elections. We did not quite get the result which the majority wanted. But that's the name of the game. We were not running a campaign for a particular party. We were ultimately pushing for an agenda of the young child. So therefore, when elected, effort was to reach the newly elected parliamentarians before they departed to the national capital to take oath, etc., so that we maintain the relationship. We also prepared report cards for the constituencies/districts where the winning candidates who signed the pledge card, so that we start having some dialogue about this is what is the status of your constituency. These are some things that you need to do to address the problems. We have had an advocacy around the key aspects that were in the manifesto, as with the point of view of the 100 days agenda. And some pieces did get picked up, partially because we had a meeting with parliamentarians in the capital after they took oath, but also because there was a media outreach, but also fundamentally because at that time maybe sufficient number of people had reached out to them with a similar set of asks across multiple locations. So in fact, some of them were saying, your people have all, how many people are you going to be, are you sending to meet us? Because we didn't try to centralize, we didn't try to control. Whosoever has the asks and has access, go forth and do your thing. Next. In terms of 122 candidates were reached in these 5 states, plus one of the provinces was also having its elections. So 54 candidates there. Plus frankly, I have no idea across the 20 states how many were reached. Because it was decentralized. At the end, in terms of report cards, signed up pledge cards in hand, 24 MPs and 19 MLAs, as in those who actually got elected. Our calculation is 10% of elected members of parliament had signed the pledge card. And coalition members during the outreach were also called by policymakers to talk about issues of the implementation of the new education policy, public health infrastructure, etc. Therefore, there was enough of an environment for people to be brought to the table for consultation when policies were being drafted. Next slide. What was effective? Strong political analysis using election margins. We actually tried to, what is the election? Prioritizing those constituencies in outreach which were marginal constituencies, where the margin at which the constituency was won last time was narrow. The idea behind doing that was not to displace the candidate, but fundamentally it probably would be a place where the party may be sufficiently flexible, would maybe more ready to listen to citizen voices in those constituencies. And we, as the colleague from Mindaru was talking about, opinion polls really matter. What is the message? What's the overarching popular opinion? Where is the direction of discourse? Has been critical in determining the direction of the campaign. It's imperative to maintain campaign party politics neutral position, irrespective of what you think personally. When each one of us comes, who is in the political, is talking about making the issue of the young child a political issue, would fundamentally would also be an individual holding political beliefs. One may be a Democrat or a Republican or whatever, but one still believes in if one believes in the issues of the young child, it's critical to rise above the party politics and push. Even if one doesn't agree with the ruling party, one still has to talk to it in case it wins. It was substantially non-branded. The planning was done with allies to have collective strength, because and it was decentralized action, mobilization worked. We had broad principles, we had common asks, and we let people do their own thing. It doesn't matter how it is done, as long as it remains party neutral, as long as the asks don't get compromised, and as long as people understand why we are asking for what we are asking. It was good to have online amplification of offline actions, because just because something is interesting has happened in a rural part of India doesn't mean that anyone knows about it unless it goes online, and it helps to ensure visibility of the mobilization. Next. What worked less well? People will still have their own political beliefs, and there is also, people are also used to talking to the opposition on the principle of the opposition picks up your asks. So therefore you get more traction with an opposition delegate. So therefore one continues doing that. It's imperative, it's critical to hedge the bets and play the long game by talking to the ruling party. It was difficult for us somewhat to sustain the momentum post-election. It got us to the table, as I said earlier, but its lobbying strategies, a different level of preparation is required for the long run, which we could have been better prepared. There's a tendency of members of parliament to sign anything while they're candidates. So therefore, you put anything before them, they kiss babies, they sign petitions. So therefore, maintaining relationship on the long run is becomes slightly more complicated. And also when it is a decentralized process, and I know someone got them to sign a pledge card, but who is this person? I don't know. So therefore, maintaining the relationship and connecting this person in the capital is the same group that met me in the village is not something that's always easy for them to connect to. I think there's one more slide there. Think political and plan for the end game. The final end game eventually is the 100 days of the new government. We're not just in the business to get candidates to sign petitions. We're in the business of making sure that the rights of the young child are respected and implemented and protected, and the policies are implemented and not just pronouncements are made. We have colleagues on the call who were part of this. Sumitra, who has been leading the alliance at this stage. So therefore, when it comes to questions, please add if I miss something. And you're muted.
Thank you, Angela. I think those are great closing comments. Think political and plan for the end game. So I recognize we are at time. I do want to give the panelists just one last moment to share any reactions, any thoughts, any commonalities or differences that they've appreciated before we wrap up. Any potential bottlenecks that you've addressed? That was a question that came through the chat. Does anybody have any sort of final remarks or want to address that question? What potential bottlenecks that you've dealt with?
I think there were a few comments in the chat about how do we, I think somebody put it in terms of how do we make sure that there's a price to pay for not supporting early childhood. And the United States, it's for us, there's a very clear line between political action like that, where you grade candidates or grade elected officials and fund campaigns, and the work that we do at the Alliance, which is more about educating elected officials, legislators, government officials. So we have to be very clear, very careful about not crossing those lines, or that if you do want to cross those lines, that you have a different designation as an organization to raise money for that kind of operation. I will say that we are trying to harness a lot of the anger and frustration that have come up through the pandemic from parents and educators in the system, and try to think about how we can build a more sustained constituency that has a powerful voice, so that they can be the ones demanding change over time, along with the advocates that we work with, to hold people accountable, to hold elected officials accountable. So if they promise they do something, they don't, there is a constituency that they have to respond to, that are demanding that they change their behavior, they change their decision. So that's kind of what we're sort of thinking about.
Thank you, Albert. And what underlies all of this, right, is there are very specific laws in each country, right, that you need to abide by when it comes to engaging, particularly in election year and with candidates. So know your local laws, know your national laws. Please.
Certainly for us, Brett, and like Albert was saying, as a philanthropist, we had to tread really, really delicately between what is electioneering versus what is advocacy. And I think Angela kind of mentioned as well around, it's not aligning to a particular party. It's about encouraging, bipartisanship, and it's really about the party that actually understands this more and takes it, understands the benefits. And I think, again, similar to Angela, we targeted key marginal seats. So that's where that notion of the price to be paid. So it's actually your seat. And one particular state here in Australia was actually critical because of the gender issue, and they lacked the recognition of the women's issue, and ignored that. It actually created quite a strong swing against the sitting government, that they actually lost the election.
Right.
And the power of using childcare, because childcare was cross-cutting. So you could talk at it in the lens of the pandemic. The childcare industry collapsed. The education system didn't collapse. The health system didn't collapse. So it's not. So what is it about the childcare sector that's not sustainable? Yet, when it came to maintaining the health workforce, the education workforce, childcare all of a sudden became, important to those frontline workers. yeah, it wasn't supported and wasn't recognized, you know.
Yes, thank you, Juan. Well,
The other piece related, sorry for we're already over time. The other piece about knowing the law is what is a lot of the mobilization that one does can also be packaged as voter awareness.
Mhm.
We are not doing, we are making people aware about the provisions in other parties' manifestos with respect to education, the young child, etc., rather than influencing candidates. So therefore, that's another way of packaging, of skirting the boundaries.
right, right. Education versus lobbying versus grassroots advocacy. Must know those laws. They're very complicated and often not very clear, but critically important. Okay, well, I just want to, we are at time. I do want to just send one more thanks to our terrific panelists. It was a very illuminating conversation. And the fact that we're over time suggests there's more to unpack here, and let's do that. Let's continue to unpack these issues and learn from each other and recognize the importance of policy advocacy is because we're all advocates, right? And we all can be advocates. And on this issue, the data is on our side. We have such strong evidence base and we have really strong messages. The key is getting the right message to the right people. With that, I'd just like to conclude our webinar today. Again, thank you all for joining us. We will send around a recording, and please, we'll send a link to our call to action, and let this be the first of many conversations that we have about advocacy and policy and childcare. So thank you all for joining us, and have a terrific morning, afternoon, and evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you to everybody, and have a nice day and evening. Good night.
Yeah, for you too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was very nice.
Bye-bye.
And we will be coming back to all of you.
Yeah, and for sure you can share our presentation, okay?
Thank you. Thank you, Miriam.
Likewise.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye.
Thank you,
Again.
Brett.